Good evening, gentlemen, ladies, whoever are the students out there. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been in class. Had Thanksgiving holiday last week. I hope yours was a good one. Mine was. I had a good time visiting with family in Arkansas. This is actually the second time I've recorded this lesson. I recorded it yesterday, only I didn't record it. I forgot to push or click on one of the buttons that I was supposed to click on. I push record, and then it tells me, do you want to record on this computer? And I forgot to push, I want to record on this computer. So that's just my whining for the day, I guess. This is our 16th week in our class of Georgia School of Preaching, Introduction to the Old Testament. And tonight we're going to kind of skip forward a bit. We covered Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and that takes us up to the time of and into the time of the Babylonian captivity. So last week we saw them, that is the Jews, the Jewish people, they're in Babylon, or by the river Kibar, as Ezekiel puts it, and they are bemoaning the fact that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed or is being destroyed. And they're crying about the fact that God has deserted them. Now, this is something they brought upon themselves, and this is something that God had prophesied was going to happen, and they didn't turn from their ways. But now that it's actually happened, they are, I don't know if they're sorry for themselves, sorry for how they treated God, but they believe that God has deserted them, and therefore their hope as a nation is lost. And Ezekiel's prophecy was to say, no, it's not lost. God has still something else planned. You will go back home. The prophets also said that they would go back home. Maybe not those people, but in 70 years, the people would go back home to Jerusalem. But Ezekiel gave them a picture of the future, I think, speaking of the church, and that the culmination of all that God has been doing with the Jewish nation was going to be in the coming of the Messiah and the establishment of the church, or the kingdom of God, which would be a very different kind of kingdom than the physical kingdom in which they existed. And so they had trouble picturing that. And I would imagine Ezekiel's symbolic prophecies at the end of his book, in my mind anyway, it wouldn't help that a whole lot. But he did give them a hope of the future. Daniel also prophesied during the time of the captivity. I'm going to hold, however, a covering of Daniel to a later date. We haven't got much more time, but I wanted to skip to the end of the captivity in our lesson this evening and look at some of the events that took place after the 70 years. After the 70 years, we will find, let me go back over the prophets again. You got major prophets and minor prophets, the way that we divide them in our Bibles, but that's not a real good division. A better division would be prophets before the exile, prophets during the exile, and prophets after the exile. That would be a good chronological division. And I think that's the way the Hebrew Bible is organized. But we're going to go, we've looked at prophets prior to the exile: Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Ezekiel was before and during. We've looked at prophets during the exile, and I want to go back and look at Daniel because he's also during the exile. But his prophecy is kind of a different kind of prophecy, and that's why I'm kind of saving him for later. And also I want to look at some prophets after the exile. When we get to the portion of history of after the exile, we've got two playing fields to work with. You got the people who actually went back home from Jerusalem. There were three groups of people, one under Zerubbabel, one under Ezra, and one under Nehemiah, that went back from Babylon or from the captivity to Jerusalem to rebuild and do the things that were needed there in Jerusalem. But along with, or in addition to those who went, there were those who stayed. In fact, probably more stayed than went. You got to figure that these people have been there 70 years, 2 or 3 generations. In fact, imagine your family being in a particular location for 70 years. That's the lifespan of one man. But during that lifespan of one man, you'll have 2 or 3 generations in that family, and they will set up business there. They'll buy homes there. And that's what they did. They lived in Babylon or in the captivity. They went as captives, but they became a part of the population. They weren't treated as, or at least not all of them, weren't treated as slaves while they were in captivity like they were when they were in Egypt before Moses brought them out. So what I want to do tonight is look at the playing field that's in Babylon, or still over in the captivity. They're not captives anymore. They just live in a different land than their native land. Their native land is Jerusalem or Judea. And some of them didn't go back because they made homes and families where they ended up, or where they were there. And they preferred that as to going back to Jerusalem and doing really what would be a very hard work, and turned out to be a very hard work. Those who went back had to rebuild, but before they rebuilt, or as they rebuilt, they had to deal with the people who had moved into the land, their homeland, while they were gone. The Jews were basically taken out of the land and replaced either by enemies that were local to the area at the time, or particularly with the Assyrians. And the northern tribe of Israel, the Assyrians had a policy of they will take you out of your land, put you somewhere else, and then take somebody else out of their land and put them in your land. So much of the population of the northern, where the northern tribes of Israel were foreign nations. And when the Jews came back home from Babylon, those people thought that was their land. The people who had taken the place of the Jews, they'd been there for 70 years, just like they were gone for 70 years, and that land had become theirs in their mind. So when they came back, they had to fight for the land. Even though they had permission from the king, it was still a lot of animosity, to say the least, when they came back to the land. And so the conflicts that we'll see in Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophet Haggai, they were primarily over, or at least to a degree, over these people that became their homeland, the foreigners that were in the land that became their homeland, and they were going to, they had lived there, farmed there, built houses there, and they didn't want to give it up. And so there's going to be that conflict. But that's not what I want to look at this evening. I want to look at a situation that's from among the captives who stayed in the land. And because I made a mistake last night in recording this and not recording it, I'm going to go check and make sure I'm doing that. Hang on just one second while I check myself. Okay, it says recording. Very good. A fellow by the name of Rachel Goodrich, an author, said, life is a puzzle, a riddle, a test, a mystery, a game. And whatever challenge you wish to compare it to, he says it's a puzzle. But he says, remember that you're not the only participant in the game. No one person holds the answers, all the answers. No one person holds all the pieces or all the cards. The trick to success, he says, in this life is to accumulate teammates and not opponents. Well, I don't agree with Mr. Goodrich that life is a game. It's not. nor do I agree with the idea that life is a stage and we're all actors on it. That kind of takes away the idea of free will. But there is a truth to it, in a sense, that God has a plan in mind that God's going to accomplish. He had that plan in mind before the foundations of the world. And we are participants in that plan, and we choose to participate with him, or we choose to participate against him. And he will use our participation whichever way we choose to accomplish his will. His will is going to be accomplished. And we can do like Moses and submit to his will, or we can do like Pharaoh and harden ourselves against his will. And God will use that. Either way we choose, God will use the way that we choose to accomplish his will. But we do have free will, and we are able to do as we please, work with God or work against God, believe in God or not, but believe in God. When we come to the book of Esther, we find a woman who has some tough decisions forced upon her. She was a poor, I don't know if a slave girl is the right appropriate definition. She was a poor peasant girl in the Persian kingdom. And due to a series of circumstances, she became the most powerful woman in the world, or at least had that position of the most powerful woman in the world. And she had some hard decisions forced upon her in that situation, and that she struggles somewhat in trying to figure out her role in life, her role in the riddle of life. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a riddle in that sense, but she had to figure out exactly how her person was to be used in the, for lack of better words, the game of life. And so she needed guidance. She needed guidance from a hand that she could not see. And we'll see in the book of Esther that we're going to look at that the invisibleness of God is accentuated, you might say. His name is not even mentioned in the entire book. The only book of the Bible that the name of God is not mentioned, but it's also a book in the Bible wherein God's presence, God's providence, God's working behind the scenes is more obvious than any other book, or as obvious as any other book. So here's this young lady who's, because of the situation that's placed upon her in life, she has to learn to trust the invisible when she had at her disposal everything she could possibly conceive that she would need for existence or survival. She is queen of the universe. The only one above her is the king himself. She was in possession of every possible luxury of the time, and she would be challenged to put others in front of herself, even if it meant risking her life. And from a worldly perspective, a person who is raised on a worldly perspective, or in the way the world pushes us, the way that Satan pushes us, that's a no-brainer. You don't do that. You don't sacrifice yourself for the benefit of others. You sacrifice the welfare of others for your own benefit. And she's going to be forced with that decision as we look at this book. Before we get to that point, and I think probably you're already familiar with the story, but it's my responsibility to make sure that you are. Before we get to the point of the story of Esther, I want to go and make a quick review of how we got to where we are in the place of history of where we are in the book of Esther. I know we've done this before. It's been a few weeks since we've done it, but I think it's important as we study the text, any particular text, that we pinpoint it as to where it belongs in the scheme of redemption, pinpoint it as to where it belongs in the chronology of time. It helps us understand some of the things that are going on if we always know where we are in time in relation to Christ, where we are in time in relation to the history of Israel, where we are in time in relation to the scheme of redemption. So to do that, we go back to the beginning, the creation and the fall of humanity. The fall of humanity from a place of companionship and fellowship with God, our Creator. In this game of life, this riddle of life, what God wanted from the beginning and from before the beginning, the reason He created was that so that we would have fellowship. He wanted to demonstrate His love. He wanted to manifest His love. And so He created us so that He could love us and so that we would love Him. But He wanted to have us, or He wanted to give us heaven. He wanted to give us life. That's what agape is. It's serving someone else, even if it requires sacrificing of your own self, serving someone else. And God agape'd us. He had agape for us. He even before He created us, He wanted to love us and to give us what He has. And so that's the reason for the creation. And we have this story recorded for us, I guess, for a couple of reasons, the story of creation and the fall. One, God wants us to know from whence we came. He wants us to know that we came from God, that He is our Creator. And He wants us to understand and see His desire for our fellowship. He wants us to have life. He wants us not to have death. We need to see from Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 that it was Satan's deception that led us to death, not God's desire. Now, God did say, in the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die. But that wasn't God saying, I want you to die. He's saying, don't do that. Don't go that way. I have life provided for you. You can walk in communion with me in this garden for eternity. But Satan came into the garden. He wants to thwart God's purpose. He wants to bring harm to humanity. And so he lies to Adam and Eve. They believe the lie rather than believe the reality that they were living. They believed the lie. And God's desire, you might say, is thwarted. God wanted them to have life. God wanted them to have fellowship with Him. He is life, and fellowship with Him means life. If we break that fellowship through disobeying His commands, really a better way to put that in my mind is by going against who God is. God is holy, and if we choose to be holy with Him, we have life. If we choose not to be holy, well, the only other option is death. But God created because He wants our fellowship, and He wants us to want His fellowship. The record continues by showing us, as a result of the breaking of the fellowship with God, they're cast out of the garden, and God shows us that when you have an existence without God, you really have a hell on earth. And I really think that's the idea behind the concept of hell in the New Testament. That concept is not really demonstrated well in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we're given a picture of hell. And the picture, it's flames of fire and fire and brimstone and weeping and gnashing of teeth and outer darkness. All these pictures are not necessarily given so that we'll see a physical place, but God wants you to understand the kind of existence you will have without God, because that's what hell is. It's an existence without God. And that's what the people that God created chose. When they chose to go to believe the lie, they chose to have an existence without God. And so God showed them what that existence would be like, and shows us that existence. And when you read Genesis chapter 4, 5, and 6, you see that the world, the population became so vile, so evil, that every imagination of every thought was evil continually. They were violent. They were killing each other. They were raping each other. It was, when we get to the Exodus and we see the 10 Commandments, the first two are love God and love one another. And that's the essence of the law. And if Adam and Eve had stayed with that, although that wasn't the law given them, it no doubt was there in their understanding, love God and love one another. If they had stayed with that, Genesis chapter 6 would never have taken place. Genesis chapter 4 would never have taken place. But it did. And In order to maintain an existence with man, God made covenants with man. Three of them are particularly emphasized in the Old Testament. There are several covenants, but we'll only mention three. Noah's covenant: I will not destroy the earth like this again. God cleansed the earth of sin and started over, essentially. He says, I won't do that again. And he made a covenant with Noah with the rainbow and on that issue. And then a few hundred years later, we have the covenant that he made with Abraham. I will bring from you a nation, and that nation will produce a seed that will be a blessing to the world. One of the matters of confusion or I don't know if confusion is the right word, but misunderstanding for the Jews is they thought the covenant, or still think that the covenant was with Abraham was with the Jews, that God was going to create a nation, and that was the end goal, is to create the nation. God's end goal was never the creation of the Jewish nation. God would create the Jewish nation as a tool, as an instrument to bring in the one who would be a blessing to the world. And then there's a Davidic covenant where God said, I will bring from you, David, a Jew, of the tribe of Judah, I will bring from your loins a king who will rule in my kingdom. Along the way, we've seen God rescue Abraham's children from Egypt, bring them through the wilderness and into the promised land. We've heard them make vows of faithfulness to God there at Mount Sinai, and God vowing faithfulness to them around 1500 BC. Then we saw them after the 40 years of wilderness wandering, which was a self-imposed punishment, or not self-imposed, God imposed it, but they brought it upon themselves when they did not choose to believe in the God who split the sea and rescued them from Egypt. They refused to trust in him, and he says, okay, you don't trust in me, you can't go into my land. So 40 years later, they went into the land of Canaan, and they began to eye with jealousy the ways of the Canaanites. God said, don't look at them. Don't go in with an eye of jealousy. Go in and destroy them. Blot out their existence, because their existence is evil. It was just like the existence of the people of Noah's day. God went in and destroyed the world because their existence could not be changed. They had so embedded themselves in evil that they could not change. It's not that God could not save them if they did, but they would not. They had the thoughts of the imaginations of their hearts were evil, and that continually. And so was the way of the Canaanite. God for 400 years had tried to, or had given opportunity for the Canaanite to change his ways, and he only got progressively worse. So God says, when you go in, destroy the Canaanite. And rather than do that, they lusted after the ways of the Canaanite. They became unfaithful to their vow to God. You will be our God. And they became unfaithful to God. And God, in being faithful to his vow, in an effort to be faithful to his vow, when they were in their unfaithfulness, he would send one of the enemy nations that they left in the land that they were supposed to destroy, but they didn't. He would send one of them against them to torment them, to prod them back to faithfulness. If you will come back to me, I'll protect you. And they temporarily, anyway, learned the lesson, and they would come back to God. God would save them by one of the judges, and they would come back to God and remain faithful for a period of time, but then they'd fall right back into the old trap, and the cycle would continue. Eventually, the people would reject God's leadership and ask for a king. God gave them kings, but not without telling them what would happen if they had kings. In fact, 500 years before they had a king, God said, you will ask for a king, I will give you a king, and this is what's going to happen. He basically laid out their history, knowing how things would go. So he gave them kings and told them what would happen if they got them. The first king was King Saul, then there was King David, then King Solomon, then King Rehoboam. And because of the events in Solomon's reign, this kingdom split into two different kingdoms after Solomon. Rehoboam only received two tribes. Jeroboam received the 10 tribes of the north, the 10 tribes of the rebellion. At this point, we didn't go into the reigns of the kings in this class and see some of the things. There's some terrifically interesting stories that take place during the reigns of these kings, and a lot of things that we can learn from them, but we're going to have to save those lessons for your course in Georgia School of Preaching of Hebrew History. You'll have more time to devote to those. You'll have 2 courses, I believe, in Hebrew history up to the time of the kings, and then Hebrew history beginning with the time of the kings. But you'll have to cover the details of the First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, which interestingly, they weren't written at the same time. Their books basically cover the same thing, yes and no, but they're separated by time. The book of Chronicles was written after the exile. The books of Kings were most likely written before the exile, or at least maybe even some of it during the exile. But that's another question that I'm chasing after rabbits. We've noted that God's word rang true as you read through the Kings. Human kings could never give them what God gave them, what God promised them. They were guilty always of believing the lie that Satan told Adam and Eve in the garden, that satisfying physical lust would lead you to happiness and power. And what they did in satisfying their physical lust without thinking about God is that they left the presence of God, and then God's presence left them. The kings eventually became more and more evil. The people followed their guidance and became more and more evil. God sent messengers, the prophets, to try to turn them, but their necks were stiff, their hearts were hard, they would not be turned. So he sent them from the country, he sent them from Palestine or from Canaan, and they were gone for some 70 years. And that's really a condensed version. There were more than one carrying away, and the northern tribes of Israel were carried away long before the southern tribes of Judah were carried away, and the northern tribes were carried away never to return, at least not as a nation. And the southern tribes, they did return eventually, as God promised them that they would. It is in the period of the exile, at least while they were exiled from the country, that the story of Esther takes place. So I want you to, again, remember that when we get to the story of Esther, we have 2 playing fields to look at. Esther is only concerned with one, and that is the one in Shushan in Persia, and the other is back in Judea. But in the book of Esther, the scenario in Judea is not being pictured, it's not being concerned with. When you get to Nehemiah, you'll have both playing fields, and same thing with Ezra. You'll have both playing fields involved. But in Esther, where it's a concentrated story, there's a lesson, there's a moral here in the book of Esther. It's not just a recording of history, it's not just a telling of a story. There is a moral for us to learn. So as we come into this book and into this time of the book of Esther, which is approximately, not exactly, but approximately 500 years, a little better, before Christ, we have to see that we're not in Jerusalem. We're not following the Jewish religion. We are in a pagan, worldly city, far from Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not even being considered. So all the Jewish culture, the Jewish sacrifices, all the things that we are very familiar with living in Judah or living in Jerusalem, those things are not a part of life as we come to where we are in Babylon or in Persia. In this story, we meet a young woman, a girl at first, and her name is Esther. Her Jewish given name is Hadassah, and Esther is the name that she would be given as a Persian. And it gave, just like Daniel's name, Belteshazzar, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's names, they all gave uh, allegiance, well, not allegiance, they recognized the pagan gods of the ones who gave them those names. Daniel didn't choose the name Belteshazzar, it was given to him. And the same thing with Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They were given the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego names by their captors. So as they would, their names would give credibility or credence to the pagan gods of their captors. Same thing with Esther. That's not her name. Hadassah is her name, but Esther is given to recognize the Persian and Babylonian god Ashtar or Estar. But her name is Esther in the book. And though the events of Esther occurred during the time of exile, the book of Esther is likely written after the Jews had returned to their homeland. We don't know exactly when the book was written. Most likely it was written by Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin who raised her. But at any rate, this is after the 70 years of exile, when most of the Jews, or a lot of the Jews, had gone back home to Judea, and some of them, many of them, probably most of them, stayed in Persia and Babylon. Maybe you are familiar with the Feast of Purim. It's a Jewish celebration that is still celebrated today, but a lot of folks aren't familiar with it because it's not one of the big ones. We're familiar with the Passover. We're familiar with the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot that the Jews celebrated. We're familiar with the Feast of Pentecost because it's mentioned in the New Testament. But the Feast of Purim is oftentimes overlooked by us non-Jewish people because it's doesn't get a lot of attention in the Bible. In fact, the only place it's mentioned is here in the book of Esther. It didn't come from the law of Moses. It didn't have a long 1,500-year history like the Feast of Pentecost and the Feast of Passover did. It only started some 500 years prior to Jesus coming. So it's had, in the days of Jesus, it had a 500-year history, but it didn't have the depth of history, the 1,500 years of history that Pentecost and Passover had. The word for Purim is from the Persian word pur or pur, not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but the word means to cast lots. The word for Purim, the Feast of Purim, comes from a non-Jewish word, which means to cast or choose by lot. And there's a reason why it's called that. And I want to take us to Esther chapter 9, verse 20 and following to get that picture. So if you would turn with me in your Bible to Esther chapter 9. Beginning in verse 20, we read, and Mordecai is the cousin. We're introduced to him early in the book, and I'm just giving, we're not going to go throughout the whole book. We will get the story of it, but Mordecai was a Jew, and he was the cousin who was raising Esther. Her parents had died, maybe in the captivity, maybe of old age. There's no reason given as to why they're not there. But as Esther's next of kin or Esther's closest kin, he took the responsibility of raising her. So that's who we're talking about here. Mordecai wrote these things, and he sent letters to all the Jews near and far. He's talking about people, the Jewish nation that are scattered throughout the world in clumps. They're not just a Jew here, a Jew here, a Jew here. There are clumps of Jews throughout the world, some of them in Judah and Jerusalem, some of them in the various cities of Persia. So he's sending letters to all who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, in the book of Esther, his name is sometimes called Xerxes, sometimes it's Ahasuerus. The Persian kingdom had come to be the nation of power at that time, and every Jew who lived in Persian territory because all territory was Persian territory. So Mordecai sends letters of these events, and we'll talk about that, to all the Jews throughout the world, wherever they could be found, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as these days, or the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies. The book of Esther is about the fact that there were enemies to the Jews that were trying to destroy the Jews, and the date set for that was the 15th and 14th and 15th of Adar. They were to be annihilated from the earth on those days by a fellow by the name of Haman that we'll read about in a minute. But instead of being destroyed, they had rest from their enemies on this day. And we'll see that's what the book of Esther is essentially about. Anyway, verse 22, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make these days of feasting and joy, and sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman is the nemesis in the story. He's the one who sought to destroy the Jews. The son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. That's really an interesting thought right there, the Agagite. Do you remember King Saul? He was sent to, I forget the city, slips my mind right now, but he was sent by God to this city to destroy the city. All the inhabitants of the city, cattle, sheep, everything was to be destroyed. And King Saul went and did that, except he saved the best of the cattle and the best of the sheep, and he saved King Agag from death and brings him home. What was his reason? I can't say. But anyway, he brings King Agag home. Samuel comes back and he says, weren't you told to destroy? Oh, yeah, I did. I destroyed everything. Well, what is the lowing of the sheep or lowing of the cattle and the bleating of the sheep that I hear? Oh, well, we did save the best of the flock for sacrifices. It's better to sacrifice, better to obey than to sacrifice, Samuel says. And then it comes to light that Saul had saved King Agag from the battle. Samuel rebukes Saul and tells him, you're going to lose the kingdom because of this, and he hacks Agag to pieces. Well, apparently Agag had family that Saul had saved as well, because rather than them being destroyed in the city as God had told Saul to do, here we have some 500 years later, Haman, the Agagite. He is a descendant of King Agag, or the family of Agag. Had Saul done what he was supposed to do 500 years prior, approximately 500 years prior, about 1,000 years prior, about 500 years prior, had he done what he was supposed to do, there would be no Haman in the story of Esther. But there is a Haman, and it's because of what Saul refused to do so many years before. Anyway, verse 24, Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast he had cast the lot to consume and destroy them. He had some priests, and he said, I want to destroy these people from the earth, and we'll find out why in a minute, but he wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and I need your help. I need you to tell me what is the best day to do that. So they cast the lot, and they discerned that the best day to do that is the 14th and 15th of Adar. So that's the reason the feast is called Pur or Purim. Verse 25, but when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that his wicked plot, which Haman had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim after the name Pur, therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to this prescribed time. So here's the beginning of the Feast of Purim, and that the days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish from among their descendants. Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. The first letter that they had sent out was warning the Jews this is going to take place. Haman's going to kill all the Jews. And now they send a second letter saying, no, it's not going to happen. It's been fixed. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdoms of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth to confirm the days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai, the Jew, Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves, their descendants, concerning matters of fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed the matters of Purim as it is written in the book. So he starts out speaking of these events. These events that are mentioned there in verse 20 are described throughout the rest of the book, and it's the purpose of the book to describe those events and show what happened. And I'm sure you know the story. It's not a new story, and it's told regularly in Bible classes. In Esther chapter 1, the king Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, throws a grand banquet for all of his majors, generals, governors. He's going to be going to war before too long, and so he has this great big celebration for his commanders and soldiers and so forth, and it's a very extravagant thing. And during the celebration, he asked that his queen, his wife, Vashti, come and be presented before the people. Some people say that he was asking her to dance naked before the people. There's no way to discern that. We don't know exactly what was the purpose here, but whatever the purpose was, whether good or evil, Queen Vashti said, no, I don't want to do that. And she rejected the word of the king. Well, you don't reject the word of the most powerful man on earth. And some of the other officials said, if the queen gets away with this, then our wives will begin to reject our authority. And so something had to be done. So what was done is Queen Vashti was relieved of her queenly duties. She was banished from the kingdom and cast out. Esther chapter 2, that sets the stage for Esther chapter 2. Esther, there's a great beauty contest that was held. The king wanted a new queen. And so he holds a beauty contest, and through the providence of God, Esther, a servant girl, peasant servant girl, takes the throne, the queen's throne in Persia. It also in chapter 2 is noted that Mordecai, Esther's cousin and caretaker, he worked for the king in some capacity, maybe as security, and he had uncovered a plot to kill the king and thwarted the plot and therefore saved the king's life. And that's given us as a piece of information in chapter 2. We'll see why that piece of information is given. In Esther chapter 3, Haman comes onto the scene. He is the right-hand man of the king, and he hates the Jewish people. Really, he hates Mordecai, and he hates all of Mordecai's people. Maybe he found out that it was Mordecai's people who had killed his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, King Agag. But whatever the reason, he hates the Jewish people because he hates Mordecai. He hates Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow to Haman. Haman's a very proud man. He was the second-ranking man in the kingdom, and he expected that people should bow down to him. And Mordecai said, "I'll not bow down to a man." And this infuriated Haman, and he vowed to himself that he would destroy the Jewish people because of Mordecai's stiff-necked or unwillingness to bow. Esther chapter 4, Mordecai finds out Haman's plan, or is told Haman's plan, and he elicits Esther's help. Esther is now queen. He elicits her help on behalf of the Jews. And Esther's saying, I can't really do anything about it because I can't approach the king without the king extending his scepter to me. If I go into the throne room and ask him anything for any purpose and he has not invited me to come in, I can be surely put to death. It's the Persian law. But Mordecai encourages her to, and tells her that if you do not do this, the Jewish people will die. Don't think that you will save yourself from death by not doing anything. And if you don't do something here, God, he doesn't use the name God, but he knows that somehow God will bring salvation from another source, but Queen Esther would die. So Esther, in chapter 5, she fearfully and courageously, bravely approaches the king and was able to accomplish the goal. Mordecai, in chapter 6, as you recall, from chapter 2, Mordecai had been saved, or had saved the king from certain death when he uncovered a plot to kill the king. And on this occasion, the king was having a sleepless night for whatever reason. And in order to put him to sleep, he had one of his scribes read from the Chronicles of the King. Tell me some old stories and put me to sleep, he says. And so the scribe did so, and he just happened to read the story about where the king's life was saved by somebody uncovering a plot to kill the king. And the king said, well, does this Chronicles ever say that the man was ever rewarded for that? And you read through it. No, it doesn't. Well, we should do that. And Haman comes in the next morning, and Haman's a very proud man. He believes he is the most loved by the king. And the king says, Haman, I want to reward somebody in my kingdom. And I want you to tell me what would you do? What is the best reward that I can give for a person that I love in my kingdom, that I want to reward graciously? And so Haman thinking, oh, he's going to promote me. He's going to reward me. He's talking about me. So you should do this, 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 and this. And the king says, that's a really good idea. Go and do that for Mordecai. Well, you can just imagine how that might have felt, because Haman has this passion of hatred for Mordecai, and yet Haman has not only got to go and reward Mordecai, but he has to do the rewarding himself. He has to lead him through the city and say, bow before the king's anointed, speaking about Mordecai. And that really infuriated, insulted Haman. It was about that time that in chapter 7 that Esther reveals that what Haman has been doing behind the scene, he has manipulated the king into making this order to where all the Jews were going to be killed, and Esther herself, being a Jew, was going to be executed. And that throws things into a tailspin, and it resulted in the king ordering Haman to be killed on his own gallows that he had made to kill Mordecai on. And then the king, he couldn't change the law because the laws of the Medes and Persians can't be changed, but he could enact new laws. And what he did was, there was a law stated that on the 14th and 15th of Adar, all the Jews were to be killed, but the king made a new law that says the Jews can arm themselves, and the king's soldiers themselves would also arm themselves against anyone who would attack or kill the Jews. And that's how the Jews will be saved. In Esther chapter 9, the Jews punished their enemies, and the feast of Purim is established. In Esther chapter 10, the Mordecai, his renowned intervention and boldness are briefly described as the book closes out. Again, I want to remind you that where these events are taking place, we are in Persia. The last we saw of the Jews in the book of Ezekiel was that they were in Babylon. How do we end up what happened between Ezekiel and Esther that we are in Persia and not Babylon. We didn't cover the book of Daniel, but the book of Daniel really answers that question. While the Babylonians were in power, the Medo-Persian kingdom came and took over Babylon, and Babylon is no more. At least the Babylonian power is no more. It is now the world power is the Medes and the Persians, and eventually it's the Persians who went out in that. It was Cyrus the Mede who sent the Jews back home, as Isaiah had prophesied that he would some 400 years prior to that. And many went back home for the purpose of rebuilding Jerusalem, but more stayed in Persia. Again, that's where they had raised their families. That's where they had started their business. They had been well established in the land. And so they didn't want to go back to Jerusalem, because that would be a very uneasy, difficult life. They got to go back and rebuild the city. They have to reestablish businesses. It's a poor land. It was economically depressed. They would have to be worried about enemies that live in the area had taken over the area, and they were going to have to take the land back from them. So it would not be, and it'd be a lot easier to stay in Persia and just continue. No, here, take some money, go back and you do this, but I'm going to stay here. And that's what happened. And Mordecai and his family were among those who stayed. I'm not trying to put any ill motive on them for that, but they didn't go back. They stayed in Persia. In the story that unveils in this narrative, the Jewish race comes under attack, but is spared by God's unseen hand. And that's really the story of the book of Esther. These events result in the culmination of known as Purim, of the feast of Purim, which the Jews celebrate even today. An interesting way that they celebrate it. Well, I won't go into all that because I don't have time. We're reading about this because after the exile, the Jews needed to be reminded that of their deliverance while they were in exile. The Jews had the impression that God had deserted them, and the book of Esther really is a story that says God's still here, God's still in charge, God's still fulfilling his promise. And here's a story to show that that's the case. Even while in captivity, God used his people to accomplish his mission, to bring about his mission. If Haman is successful in doing what he wanted to do, there will be no Messiah. If Haman is successful in doing what he intended to do, that there's nothing beyond the book of Esther. There's no book of Matthew. There's no book of Mark, Luke, or John. So God intervenes and does what he does there in the book of Esther, even though he's not, his name is not mentioned. His presence is seen on every page. At the center of the book of Esther is a statement that I want us to look at, a statement of our faith. Go to chapter 4. It says, "So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, 'Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than any other Jews.'" Mordecai had sent a note to Esther, the queen, saying, "Haman's going to do this. We need to do something." And she says, "I can't do anything. I can't go before the king." And so he wrote her another letter and says, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, and relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews," Mordecai has great faith in the providence of God, or deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. So if you put yourself in Esther's shoes, queen of the universe, every possible luxury at her feet, at her beck and call, and Mordecai is saying, the Jewish nation is going to die if you don't do something. And she could be thinking from a very worldly perspective as, well, that's their problem, not mine. And I don't think that was her thought process at first, but her thought process at first was that, if I go in and on behalf of these people before the king, I die because I don't have the right to come before the king like that. Remaining silent would result not only, Mordecai says, in her demise, but in the demise of the Jewish nation. You need to speak up. And so she did. And I think part of the point, the moral that I spoke of earlier in the book, is that we need to have such a concern, such a faith in God, that we will, in order for to benefit the kingdom, not look at ourselves, not look at our own security, not look at our own place, but for the benefit of the kingdom, do what God says do. I look at the life of the Apostle Paul in the same way. He became a great apostle, a great Christian, a great preacher of the faith, and to do so, he sacrificed everything this life had to offer. He was on the road to being one of the greatest Jews, rabbis ever to have lived, and he would have been lauded and praised throughout the Jewish kingdom of that time. But he sacrificed it all because he believed that God was doing something greater. And eventually he did lose his life because of his faith. Here, Esther is given that opportunity. Will you serve yourself, or will you serve God? Will you serve the purpose of God? She takes a huge step in faith and does what she does here. And the encouragement for us today is to do the same. Life in the kingdom is not always going to be easy. There will be times in your life that you will be called upon by God to sacrifice your own desires, sacrifice your own needs in order to accomplish something that you may never see any benefit from. We need to have the spirit of Esther. If I die, I die. But I'm concerned about the future of God's kingdom. As a preacher, if that's your choice, oftentimes you will have to make sacrifices for the benefit of the people. You'll not be rewarded. Sometimes you'll be hated. I don't think we need to make it our goal to be hated by the people, but if we preach the truth of God is going to be in opposition to the ways of the world. And so we're not going to be always loved. Those who are faithful Christians will love us, but sometimes the faithful Christians aren't around. Sometimes the faithful Christians turn against us because they're not faithful Christians. They have their own agendas, and the truth oftentimes is in conflict with those agendas. We need to be willing to come, to step out like Esther did. And if I die, I die. But it's God's kingdom that's more important. The purposes of God that are more important. And the purpose of God may be that you sacrifice yourself in order that the kingdom might be benefited. I think of the people, the Christians of the first century. God used their deaths, and they might have in the end thinking, my death is in vain, but God used their deaths to end the persecution. He used their death in persecution to end the persecution. Think about it from this perspective. They were being killed because they were Christians. The world hated Christians because maybe the lie of Nero. The world hated Christians because the Christians were atheists in the world's thinking. The world worshiped pagans. The Christians would not do that. The pagan gods were given credit for the financial successes or ruins of cities and nations, and the Christians would not worship those gods. So they were, if financial ruin came to a city or to a person, it was because of the Christians. They wouldn't worship those gods. And so for various reasons, the Christians were persecuted even unto death, crucified, thrown to the lions, and so forth. Peter and Paul both teach the Christians that uh, to be faithful to God even during those fiery trials, and don't become a rabble rouser. Don't become a person who is against the culture, or at least against the people. Don't fall into sin. Don't do things that are evil, but submit to, Peter says, the ruling authorities, and live a godly life. Even when they accuse you of doing evil as you're doing godly, continue to live a godly life. And they did that, and the result was they were killed. But that's not the only result. Eventually, enough of those deaths took place that the society was standing back and looking and saying, these people, I don't like their religion, I don't like their faith, but they're not bad people. They're not thieves, they're not murderers, they're not doing bad things. And eventually, the persecution stopped, because the pagan world realized that they were killing the best people of the land. And God knew that would be the case. The point is, as Christians, as God's people, we do what's right and what's good, even if it requires sacrifice ourselves, because God knows the future. He knows it will benefit the kingdom, and you will be rewarded in God's way, not necessarily in the world's way. You will be rewarded in God's way. Who knows? My question is, or Mordecai's question is, who knows that what you're going through right now is the purpose that God called you into the kingdom? And maybe you can't see how what you're going through right now is going to bring any good success or good point, but trust God like Esther did, and know that whatever you do here, whether you live or die, God's kingdom is going to benefit. I think that's the moral of the book of Esther. And another reason that the book of Esther is here is to show us that God did not forsake his purpose. He did not forsake his people. And if there is no book of Esther, there is no coming Messiah, because all the Jews would have died. But again, like Mordecai told Esther, God will rescue the Jews because he has a promise to fulfill through bringing the Messiah, but it would come not through Esther, but through some other family. All right, next up is Ezra and Nehemiah. I will pause for now, and we'll come back to that in our next hour.